I stood before my family's portrait in the East drawing room on the morning they removed me from it. Not from the canvas itself. I had never been painted there to begin with. But from memory, from record, from the careful lies my stepmother told at tea. The frame was gilded, the brushwork impeccable. My father sat at the center, his new wife beside him in sapphire silk, her daughters arranged like porcelain ornaments on either side. There was no space where I should have been. There had never been any intention of making one. The room smelled of beeswax and roses, though it was November, and the roses were long dead. Rain drummed against the windows with the steady patience of something that knows it will outlast stone. I was 23 years old. I had lived in this house my entire life, and I understood in that moment that I had been living in it as a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My stepmother entered without knocking. She never knocked. The house had become hers the moment my father signed the marriage settlement, and she moved through it with the authority of someone who believes ownership and virtue are the same thing. She glanced at me, then at the portrait, then back at me with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and triumphant. "Your father thought it best," she said. "A family portrait should represent the family as it is now. You understand. I understood perfectly. My mother had been dead for 8 years. Her dowry had rebuilt the West Wing and settled my father's debts. I was the evidence of her existence, and therefore inconvenient. My stepmother had brought 2 daughters, a modest fortune, and the ability to make my father forget he had ever loved anyone before her. In this new arrangement, I was a shadow from an earlier marriage, a remnant that cluttered the narrative she was constructing. "Of course," I said. My voice was steady. I had learned steadiness the way other women learned embroidery. She smiled, relieved that I would not make a scene. "I knew you would be reasonable. You've always been so sensible, Eleanor. Not like other girls who make such a fuss over nothing. Nothing." That word would echo in my mind for years, the sound of my existence being reduced to a footnote, then erased entirely. The years before that morning had been a slow erasure, so gradual I had not recognized it as violence. After my father's remarriage, I was moved from my mother's rooms to a smaller chamber on the 3rd floor, the one that faced north and never caught the sun. My place at dinner shifted farther from my father's end of the table with each passing month until I sat near the servants' entrance, where the draft made the candles gutter. My stepsisters were given my mother's jewels to wear to their first season. When I asked my father about it, he looked surprised, as if he had forgotten I existed at all. "Your mother would have wanted them to be worn," he said. "She was always generous. My mother had been generous. She had also been deliberate. She had left those jewels to me in her will, along with a trust that was meant to provide my independence. But wills, I learned, are only as strong as the men who execute them. And my father had found ways to redirect that money toward more pressing needs. The roof, the debts, my stepmother's redecorating. There was always something more pressing than a daughter's future. I became a fixture in the house, neither family nor servant, occupying a space that everyone agreed was charitable of my father to provide. I was useful when guests needed a fourth for whist, or when my stepmother required someone to read aloud while she embroidered, or when packages needed collecting from the village. I was invited to family gatherings only when my absence would raise questions, and at those gatherings I was introduced as my late wife's daughter, a phrase that made me sound like an inheritance no one wanted to claim. I had loved my father once. I had believed he loved me. But love, I discovered, is not the same as priority, and grief is a poor match for convenience. He had mourned my mother sincerely, I think, for almost 6 months. Then he had remarried, and mourning became impolite. Remembering became disloyal. And I, who carried my mother's eyes and her quiet way of moving through rooms, became a reminder he no longer wished to see. But I had inherited something else from my mother, something my family never noticed because they never looked closely enough. I could draw. Not the delicate watercolors expected of young ladies, flowers and landscapes fit for parlor walls. I could render a face with such precision that the soul behind it became visible. I could capture in charcoal and ink the truth that people worked so hard to conceal. My mother had been an artist before her marriage, trained in Florence by a master who recognized her gift. She had given it up, as women did, but she had taught me in secret in the years before she died. We would steal hours in the old conservatory, where the light fell clear and gold through glass, and she would guide my hand across paper, teaching me to see not just shape, but essence. "Art," she told me, "is the only honest language. Everything else can be a lie. After her death, I continued alone. I filled sketchbooks with studies of hands, trees, the curve of a staircase, the way light fell across my father's face when he thought no one was watching. I drew my stepmother's daughters in their fine dresses, and I captured the hardness in their eyes that their beauty disguised. I drew the servants in the kitchen, and the way exhaustion and dignity could live in the same expression. I drew obsessively, compulsively, because it was the only way I could make sense of a world that had decided I did not exist. No one knew. I kept my work hidden in a trunk beneath my bed, wrapped in muslin. To my family, I was simply the quiet girl who caused no trouble, who had no ambitions, who would eventually be married off to some minor gentleman willing to overlook my diminished prospects. The fracture came on a February evening during one of my stepmother's carefully orchestrated dinner parties. She had invited a young widower from the neighboring estate, a man of moderate fortune and immense respectability, and it became clear by the second course that he was being offered my eldest stepsister as a prospective wife. She was 19, beautiful, accomplished in all the ways that mattered. She played the pianoforte. She spoke French. She had never had an original thought in her life. I was seated far enough away to be beneath notice, but close enough to hear everything. The widower was kind, soft-spoken, and obviously lonely. He spoke about his late wife with a tenderness that made my stepsister stifle a yawn behind her napkin. When he mentioned that his wife had been an amateur painter and how much he missed having art in his home, my stepmother's eyes gleamed. "How fortunate," she said. "My daughter is quite the artist. She paints the most charming watercolors." My stepsister smiled demurely, though I knew for a fact she had never painted anything more ambitious than a bowl of fruit, and that had required 3 attempts and the drawing master's heavy-handed corrections. The widower brightened. "I would be delighted to see her work." "Oh, she's far too modest," my stepmother said, casting a meaningful glance at her daughter. "But perhaps she could be persuaded." After dinner, we gathered in the music room where my stepsister's watercolors had been arranged on an easel with suspicious preparedness. The widower examined them with polite enthusiasm, though even he could see they were competent at best. Charming, as my stepmother had promised, but empty of any real feeling or skill. "Lovely," he said, though his voice held a note of disappointment. My stepmother was not finished. "Eleanor," she said suddenly, turning to me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "don't you sketch a little? Perhaps you could show Mr. Hartley your drawings." It was a game, a way to demonstrate her daughter's superiority by comparison. She assumed my work would be amateurish, embarrassing, further evidence that I was the lesser daughter in every respect. I should have declined. I should have murmured something about having nothing worth showing. Instead, I heard myself say, "If you wish." I excused myself and climbed the stairs to my room, my heart beating hard against my ribs. I opened the trunk and looked at years of hidden work, hundreds of drawings, studies, portraits. I chose carefully. I selected a portrait I had done of my mother from memory, a study of the kitchen maid that captured her youth and weariness, and a drawing of my father that showed exactly what he had become. When I returned to the music room, the conversation had moved on. No one expected me to actually produce anything, but I laid the drawings on the table beside my stepsister's watercolors, and I watched Mr. Hartley's expression change. He leaned forward, his earlier politeness transforming into genuine attention. He studied each piece in silence, and the silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. When he finally looked up, he did not look at me with the dismissive kindness I was accustomed to. He looked at me as if I had just revealed myself to be someone else entirely. "These are extraordinary," he said quietly. "Who taught you?" "My mother." "She must have been remarkable." "She was." My stepmother's smile had frozen into something brittle. My stepsister stared at the drawings as if they were evidence of a betrayal. My father, who had been dozing by the fire, stirred and frowned. "Eleanor always had a little talent for copying," my stepmother said quickly. "Nothing serious, of course, just a pastime." But Mr. Hartley was not listening to her. He was looking at the portrait of my father, and in his eyes, I saw recognition. He saw what I had drawn, not the respectable gentleman my father presented to the world, but the weakness beneath, the small surrenders, the man who had traded his daughter's inheritance for peace in his household. "May I ask," Mr. Hartley said, still looking at the portrait, "have you ever exhibited your work?" "No." "You should." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. My stepmother laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Exhibit? Don't be absurd. Eleanor is not a professional artist. She's a young lady. She's an artist, Mr. Hartley said, and there was a firmness in his voice that silenced her. A significant one. He left soon after, pleading an early morning. He did not propose to my stepsister. He did not return for further visits. But 2 weeks later, I received a letter in his hand, delivered discreetly by a servant I did not recognize. The letter was brief. Mr. Hartley wrote that he had taken the liberty of showing sketches of my work to an acquaintance of his, a member of the Royal Academy Selection Committee. The man had expressed interest. If I was willing, Mr. Hartley would arrange an introduction. He understood that this might be difficult given my circumstances, but he believed my talent deserved to be seen. I read the letter 3 times, standing by the window in the cold northern light of my room. Then I folded it carefully and hid it at the bottom of my trunk, beneath the drawings. I did not reply immediately. I needed to think, to plan. What followed was a period of careful, secret action. I began to prepare a portfolio, working late into the night by candlelight, creating pieces that would demonstrate not just technical skill, but vision. I painted what I knew: the constrained lives of women, the cruelty disguised as propriety, the beauty that existed in spite of suffering. I painted the truth of the world I inhabited, and I painted it with the precision my mother had taught me. I corresponded with Mr. Hartley through intermediaries, using the servants who had always been kind to me, the ones who had watched my slow erasure and understood what it meant. I learned that the Royal Academy was holding a submission period for new works. I learned that they rarely accepted women, but they did accept them, and when they did, it made news. I worked with a focus I had never known I possessed. Every stroke was deliberate. Every shadow was chosen. I painted my stepmother as Jezebel, beautiful and ruthless, draped in the jewels that had been my mother's. I painted my father as Pontius Pilate, washing his hands of responsibility. I painted myself last, not as I was, diminished and erased, but as I would become. A woman looking directly at the viewer, unflinching, with brushes in her hand and light in her eyes. 3 months later, I wrapped my paintings in cloth and had them smuggled out of the house by the gardener's son. Mr. Hartley arranged for them to be delivered to the selection committee under a pseudonym. I waited. Spring turned to summer. I continued to move through the house like a ghost, attending to my stepmother's needs, enduring my stepsister's casual cruelties, watching my father retreat further into comfortable ignorance. Then, in August, the letter came. 2 of my paintings had been accepted for the Royal Academy's autumn exhibition. Not just accepted. One had been selected for a prominent placement in the main gallery. The selection committee requested my presence at the opening. They wanted to know the identity of the artist who signed their work only as E.M., my mother's initials, which I had borrowed as both tribute and disguise. I held the letter in my hands and felt something crack open inside me. Not rage, not triumph, something quieter and more permanent. Recognition. I knew what I had to do. The opening of the autumn exhibition was held on a Friday evening in September. It was a significant social event, attended by nobility, critics, artists, and anyone who wished to be seen as cultured. My father and stepmother had received an invitation, as they did every year. They never attended. My stepmother found the art world vulgar, full of eccentrics and radicals. But this year, I made certain they would go. I told my stepmother, casually, that I had heard there would be members of the royal family in attendance. I mentioned that Lady Ashford, her greatest social rival, had been invited and would certainly be there. I suggested that my stepsisters might benefit from being seen in such elevated company, that it might improve their marriage prospects. I planted the seeds carefully, knowing exactly which ones would take root in her particular soil of ambition and insecurity. They decided to attend. I was not invited, of course. I was never invited to anything that mattered. The evening they left for the exhibition, I stood at my window and watched their carriage disappear down the drive. Then I dressed in my mother's gown, the one I had kept hidden, the one in deep crimson silk that my stepmother had tried to sell, and I followed in a hired carriage using what little remained of the trust money I had managed to protect. The Royal Academy was ablaze with light, chandeliers glittering like captured stars. I entered quietly, gave my name to the attendant, and watched his eyebrows rise. "E.M.," he murmured, and suddenly I was not a ghost, but a person of interest, guided through the crowd toward the main gallery. And there they were. My paintings, hung in positions of honor, lit to perfection. A small crowd had gathered before them, and I heard fragments of conversation. Remarkable, devastating. Who is she? As I moved closer. My painting of the woman with brushes hung at eye level, commanding the wall. Beside it hung the portrait of my stepmother as Jezebel. And though her face was not identical, anyone who knew her would recognize the likeness in the tilt of her head, the set of her mouth, the particular way she wore her cruelty like jewelry. I saw them before they saw the paintings. My father, uncomfortable in formal dress, already seeking the exit. My stepmother, scanning the room for people who mattered. My stepsisters, bored and beautiful. Fans fluttering like captive birds. I watched my stepmother's face as she registered the crowd, moved closer to see what had drawn such attention, and then stopped, completely still. I saw the moment of recognition, the dawning horror as she understood what she was looking at and what it meant. My father joined her, squinting at the placard that gave the artist's name and the painting's title. "The Pretender," he read aloud, by Eleanor Marguerite Ashford. His face went pale, not with anger, with shame, because now, in this room full of people who mattered, he had to confront what he had allowed to happen. His first wife's daughter, the one he had permitted to be erased, had just become visible in a way that could not be ignored. My stepmother turned, searching the crowd, and her eyes found mine. I was standing near the entrance, visible but not prominent, and I met her gaze without flinching. For once, I was not trying to make myself small. I was not apologizing for existing. I was simply present, undeniable, real. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. What could she say? That the paintings were lies? But everyone could see they were truth rendered in oil and pigment. That I had no right? But the Royal Academy itself had decided otherwise. That I was ungrateful? But gratitude is not owed to those who try to make you disappear. The scandal spread through the room like fire through dry grass. Eleanor Ashford, the daughter who had been kept from the family portrait, had painted herself into the permanent collection of the nation's most prestigious institution. The critics were already praising the work. The newspapers would carry the story in the morning. My father approached me slowly, as if I were something fragile that might break. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You never asked." It was the simplest truth, and it cut him more deeply than any accusation could have. He had never asked what I wanted, what I could do, who I was becoming in the small room on the third floor while he rebuilt his life around a new family. He had never asked, and so I had never told him. And now the revelation was public and permanent. My stepmother rallied quickly, as people like her always do. She moved through the crowd, smiling, claiming pride in my accomplishment, suggesting she had always encouraged my artistic pursuits. But the painting of her hung on the wall like testimony, and people looked at it, then at her, and I saw understanding dawn in their eyes. They knew, they all knew. The months that followed were a slow unraveling. My father could not undo what had been done, and my stepmother could not rewrite a story that had been painted into permanence. I was invited to exhibit more work. I was asked to take commissions. I was written about in newspapers and art journals. And with each mention, the truth of my family situation became more widely known and discussed. Society, which had ignored my erasure when it was quiet and private, was fascinated by my emergence. I became a story they wanted to tell, the overlooked daughter who had found her voice through art. I was invited to places my stepmother had once gate-kept, and she was forced to watch as doors opened for me that had been closed to her. I did not stay in my father's house much longer. Mr. Hartley's introduction led to others, and I found patrons willing to support my work in exchange for pieces that told truths they recognized but could not speak. I took a small set of rooms in Bloomsbury near other artists, and I painted every day until my hands ached. The commissions came steadily. I painted daughters and mothers, governesses and widows, women whose lives had been compressed into corners and whose faces held stories no one had bothered to ask them to tell. My work became known for its unflinching honesty, for the way it captured both dignity and damage in the same frame. My family stopped inviting me to their gatherings, which suited me perfectly. When we encountered each other at public events, we were polite and distant, like strangers who once shared an address. My stepmother's daughters married, eventually, though not as brilliantly as she had hoped. My father grew older and smaller, retreating into silence as his authority diminished. I heard he sold the family portrait to pay his debts, and somehow, that felt like justice too. I never painted another portrait of them. They were not worth the canvas. Instead, I painted the world I was building. Not the world as it was, but as it could be. I painted women reading, women teaching, women creating. I painted strength and survival. I painted the truth that beauty and power could exist in the same body, the same life, the same woman, years. Later, when I was established enough to be considered respectable, I returned to my father's house one final time. He was dying, and even after everything, he was still my father. I sat beside his bed in the room that had once been my mother's, and I held his hand while he struggled to breathe. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I failed you. I failed her." "Yes," I said, because he had. "Can you forgive me?" I thought about it, truly thought about it. Then I said, "I don't think forgiveness is what matters now. What matters is that I survived, that I became who I was always meant to be, not despite you, but without you." He closed his eyes, and I think he understood. He died 3 days later. I arranged a modest funeral. I did not weep. Now, I am 46 years old. My work hangs in galleries across Europe. I have students of my own, young women who come to me because they have been told they are too much or not enough, and I teach them what my mother taught me, that art is the only honest language and that they have a right to speak it. The house where I grew up was sold years ago to pay my father's debts. The family portrait was lost, probably burned or painted over. It doesn't matter. My portrait hangs in the National Gallery now, a gift from a collector who understood its significance. It is called Self-Portrait as an Artist, and it shows me exactly as I am, a woman with brushes in her hand, looking directly at the viewer with eyes that have seen everything and flinched from nothing. I was erased from their portrait, but I painted myself back into existence, and this time, no one can remove me. This time, I chose the frame. I chose the light. I chose every brushstroke that made me visible. And that, I have learned, is the only revenge that matters. Not destruction, but creation. Not erasure, but permanence. Not their story of who I should have been, but my own story of who I am.